This lesson is HTML5 drag and drop. In this lesson, you will enable users to visually position elements on the screen with their mouse using the new drag and drop features introduced in HTML5. The goal of this activity is to create an interactive shopping cart application. Much of the layout has already been provided, and we will simply need to add the drag and drop functionality as needed. Before we get started, it is important to note that the HTML5 drag and drop API only allows us to respond to drag and drop events. It is not actually capable of performing drag and drop operations without extra JavaScript. You will notice that a number of visual indicators exist when images and text are dragged inside of your browser. A large part of producing a drag and drop interface is displaying the appropriate visual indicator to the user. For instance, dragged images will display an icon indicating to the user that a dragged image's current location is not a valid spot to drop it. The first step in creating any drag and drop interface is deciding where on the page would be valid drop areas. For this activity, we will simply be using the shopping cart div shown here as our valid drop zone. This will be where the user will drag all of their purchases. A number of new events have been added to JavaScript, including the drag enter, drag over, and drag drop events. These events are used to respond to the different phases of a drag and drop operation and control the visual indicators displayed to the user. Now, to begin this activity, you will want to open up the file shopping.html. To display a positive indicator to the user when they drag an image over the shopping cart, one simply needs to prevent the default behavior of both the drag over and drag enter events. Preventing the default behavior of an event requires several different parts. Several event systems include a number of different functions that every event offers. For instance, the stop propagation function prevents other listeners from responding to a given event. The prevent default function, as the name suggests, prevents the event from doing whatever it was supposed to do. In this case, the default behavior of the event would be to display a negative indicator to the user. Finally, returning false from an event listener function will have basically the same effect as the two previous function calls. However, all three are necessary to maintain consistency throughout all browsers and JavaScript event systems. Now that we've prevented the default behavior of both the drag enter and drag over events, we will see that once we've tested our file, the shopping cart is no longer displaying a negative indicator when the images are dragged over it. However, we will see that when dropped on top of it, it does not have the desired effect. As a matter of fact, this browser actually opens the image inside the window upon which it was dropped. The next step in this activity is to identify the zone from which the images would be dragged. This is particularly important because we will need to save a reference to the image being dragged. Now, this would simply be done by adding the onDragStart attribute to any container inside of your document. The onDragStart event will fire whenever an item has been dragged from inside of the given list. We will simply need to determine which image was dragged and save a reference to that image so that we might use it at a later time. This code would all be added inside of the dragStart function. Now here we are simply using the event's target property. This indicates to JavaScript from which object the event originated. In this case, which image was being dragged upon. So now that we've simply stored a reference to the image being dragged, we need to respond to that image being dropped inside of a container. Specifically, we need to respond to it being dropped inside of our shopping cart. We will respond to the drop event with the function dragDrop, as shown here. Now inside the dragDrop function, all we need to do is simply take the dragged item and insert it into the shopping cart. A good deal of the shopping cart's base functionality has already been defined for this activity. We would simply need to call the function addToCart. The addToCart function has already been defined and takes two arguments. The first is which image was being dragged, and the second is simply the quantity of that image to be added to the shopping cart. Now at this point, most people would consider this done because we are simply adding the dragged item to the shopping cart. However, when we go to test this file, we're going to see that it does not behave exactly as expected. We can see that it is now still opening up the image inside of the browser. The reason for this is because the default behavior for a drop event is simply to open the image in the browser. We are going to use our prevent default function to stop this from happening. So now that we've prevented the default behavior of the drag drop event, our shopping cart will function as desired.